Alrighty, give me just a moment. Let me make sure that we are in fact live. And the internet's being weird. Not sure why. Okay, there we go. Okay. We are live on YouTube. And let's hop over to Rumble. Just to make sure. Yes, we are live on Rumble. Okay, excellent. Thank you for joining me, everyone. And for the record, if you hear any background noise, well, I do apologize. The dishwasher is currently running. So, yay, awesome. I didn't know that, but that's okay. Anyway, thank you for joining me. I am Mikhail the Stray Cat, and we're going to pick up our reading of Murray Rothbard's The Anatomy of the State at the beginning of Part 3. So, without further ados and addendums, let's go. Part 3. How the State Preserves Itself. Once a state has been established, the problem of the ruling group or caste is how to maintain their rule. Side note. On the crucial distinction between caste, a group with privileges or burdens coercively granted or imposed by the state, and the Marxian concept of class. Mises, Theory and History, New Haven, Yale University Press, 1957, page 112. End of side note. While force is their modus operandi, their basic and long-run problem is ideological. For in order to continue in office, any government, not simply a democratic government, must have the support of the majority of its subjects. This support, it must be noted, need not be active enthusiasm. It may well be passive resignation, as if to an inevitable law of nature. But support in the sense of acceptance of some sort it must be. Else the minority of state rulers would eventually be outweighed by the active resistance of the majority of the public. Since predation must be supported out of the surplus of production, it is necessarily true that the class constituting the state, the full-time bureaucracy and nobility, must be a rather small minority in the land, although it may, of course, purchase allies among important groups in the population. Therefore, the chief task of the rulers is always to secure the active or resigned acceptance of the majority of the citizens. Bulletin points 8 and 9, which I will read. Point 8. Such acceptance does not, of course, imply that the state rule has become voluntary, for even if the majority support be active and eager, this support is not unanimous by every individual. End of point 8. Point 9. That every government, no matter how dictatorial over individuals, must secure such support has been demonstrated by such acute political theorists as, and I am going to horribly butcher this name, Etienne de la Boeti. I hope I got that right, but I probably didn't. David Hume, and Ludwig von Mises. Thus, David Hume, quote, of the first principles of government, unquote, in essays, literary, moral and political, London, Ward, Locke, and Taylor in D, page 23, Etienne de la Boétie, and I'm probably totally butchering that name, Anti-Dictator, New York, Columbia University Press, 1942, pages 8 through 9. Ludwig von Mises, Human Action, New Haven, Yale University Press, 1949, page 188, and so forth. For more on the contribution to the analysis of the state by La Boétie, see Oscar Jazzi, Jazzi. I hope I'm not totally destroying that name. And John D. Lewis, Against the Tyranny, Glencoe, Illinois, The Free Press, 1957, pages 55 through 57. End of side note. Of course, one method of securing support is through the creation of vested economic interests. Therefore, the king alone cannot rule. He must have a sizable group of followers who enjoy the prerequisites of rule, i.e., the members of the state apparatus, excuse me, such as the full-time bureaucracy or the established nobility. Side note number 10. Whenever a ruler makes himself dictator, all those who are corrupted by burning ambition or extraordinary avarice, these gather around him and support him in order to have a share in the booty and to constitute themselves petty chiefs under the big tyrant. La Boétie, Op. Cit. Pages 43 through 44. End of side note. But this still secures only a minority of eager supporters, and even the essential purchasing of support by subsidies and other grants of privilege still does not obtain the consent of the majority. For this essential acceptance, the majority must be persuaded by ideology that their government is good, wise, and at least inevitable, and certainly better than other conceivable alternatives. There is no alternative. Where have we heard that before? Promoting this ideology among the people is the vital social task of the intellectuals. For the masses of men do not create their own ideas, or indeed think through these ideas independently. They follow passively the ideas adopted and disseminated by the body of intellectuals. The intellectuals are therefore the opinion molders in society. And since it is precisely a molding of opinion that the state almost desperately needs, the basis for age-old alliance between the state and the intellectuals becomes clear. Kind of sounds like the lamestream legacy media of today, doesn't it? Just saying. It is evident that the state needs the intellectuals. It is not so evident why intellectuals need the state. Put simply, we may state that the intellectual's livelihood in the free market is never too secure. for the intellectual must depend on the values and choices of the masses of his fellow men, and it is precisely characteristic of the masses that they are generally uninterested in intellectual matters. The state, on the other hand, is willing to offer the intellectuals a secure and permanent berth in the state apparatus, and thus a secure income and the panoply of prestige. Looking at you, lamestream legacy media. For the intellectuals will be handsomely rewarded for the important function they perform for the state rulers, of which group they now become a part. Bulletin point number 11. This by no means implies that all intellectuals ally themselves with the state. On aspects of the alliance of intellectuals and the state, cf. Bertrand de Juvenel. I'm probably butchering that, but oh well. Quote, the attitude of the intellectuals to the market society, unquote. The Owl, January 1951, pages 19 through 27. De Juvenel, the treatment of capitalism by continental intellectuals, unquote, in F.A. Hayek, edition Capitalism and the Historians, Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 1954, pages 93 through 123. Reprinted in George B. de Hussar. I'm probably butchering that name too. The Intellectuals. Glencoe, Illinois, The Free Press, 1960, pages 385 through 399. And Schumpeter, one or the other, opposite pages 143 through 55. End of bulletin point. The alliance between the state and the intellectuals was symbolized in the eager desire of professors at the University of Berlin in the 19th century to form the, quote, intellectual bodyguard of the House of, I am totally going to butcher this, Hohenzollern, Hohenzollern, unquote. In the present day, let us note the revealing comment of an eminent Marxist scholar concerning Professor Wittfogel's critical study of ancient Oriental despotism. Quote, the civilization which Professor Wittfogel is so bitterly attacking was one which could make poets and scholars into officials, unquote, and bulletin point number 12. Joseph Needham, quote, review of Carl A. Wittfogel, Oriental Despotism, Science and Society, 1958, page 65. Needham also writes that, quote, the successive Chinese emperors were served in all ages by a great company of profoundly humane and disinterested scholars, unquote. IBID, page 61. Wittfogel notes the Confucian doctrine that the glory of the ruling class rested on its gentleman scholar bureaucrat officials, destined to be professional rulers, dictating to the mass of the populace. Carl A. Wittfogel, Oriental Despotism, New Haven, Yale University Press, 1957, pages 320 to 21, and Passim, Passim. I'm probably butchering that. For an attitude contrasting to Needham's, cf. John Lucas, Intellectual Class or Intellectual Profession, in De Hussar Opsit, pages 521 to 22. End of bulletin point. Of innumerable examples, we may cite the recent development of the, air quotes, science, unquote, of strategy in the service of the government's main violence-wielding arm, the military. Bulletin point 13. Strategists insist that their occupation deserves the dignity of the academic counterpart of the military profession. Jean Reha, The War Plotters, Liberation, August 1961, page 13. Also, see Marcus Raskin, The Megadeth Intellectuals, New York Review of Books, November 14th, 1963, pages 6 through 7. End of bulletin point. A venerable institution, furthermore, is the official or court, air quotes, historian dedicated to purveying the rulers' views of their own and their predecessors' actions. Bulletin point 14. Yes, there are a lot of bulletin points in this particular section of this book. Point 14. Thus, the historian Conyers Reed, in his presidential address, advocated the suppression of historical fact in the service of, quote, democratic, unquote, and national values. Reed proclaimed that, quote, total war, whether it is hot or cold, enlists everyone and calls upon everyone to play his part. The historian is not freer from this obligation than the physicist. Ellipsis, end of quote. Read, quote, the social responsibilities of the historian, unquote. American Historical Review, 1951, page 283. FF for a critique of Reed and other aspects of court history, see Howard K. Moving along. Yeah, it's almost like the military-industrial complex is kind of a thing and kind of sells, to those who, I don't know, are not really thinking. I don't know. What do you think? Moving along, many and varied have been the arguments by which the state and its intellectuals have induced their subjects to support their rule. Basically, these strands of argument may be summed up as follows. A. The state rulers are great and wise men. They rule by divine right. They are the aristocracy of men. They are the scientific experts. Much greater and wiser than the good but rather simple subjects. And B. Rule by the extant government is inevitable, absolutely necessary, and far better than the indescribable evils that would ensue upon its downfall. The union of church and state was one of the oldest and most successful of these ideological devices. The ruler was either anointed by God or, in the case of the absolute rule of many Oriental despotisms, was himself God. Hence, any resistance to his rule would be blasphemy. The state's priestcraft performed the basic intellectual function of obtaining popular support and even worship for the rulers. Bulletin point 15. C.F. Whitfogel, opposite, pages 87 through 100. On the contrasting role of religion vis-a-vis the state in ancient China and Japan, see Norman Jacobs' The Origin of Modern Capitalism in Eastern Asia, Hong Kong University Press, 1958, pages 161 through 94. Another successful device was to instill fear of any alternative systems of rule or non rule. The present rulers, it was maintained, supply to the citizens an essential service for which they should be most grateful. Kind of sounds like what they tell anyone who simply asks, why are you stealing a significant portion of my paycheck? Oh, but my roads, but my infrastructure. Look what your government does for you. You should be grateful. Yeah, kind of sounds like that, doesn't it? Kind of sounds like that. Protection against sporadic criminals and marauders for the state to preserve its own monopoly of predation did indeed see to it that private and unsystematic crime was kept to a minimum. The state has always been jealous of its own preserve. Especially has the state been successful in recent centuries in instilling fear of other state rulers. Since the land area of the globe has been parceled out among particular states, one of the basic doctrines of the state was to identify itself with the territory it governed. Since most men tend to love their homeland, the identification of that land and its people with the state was a means of making natural patriotism work to the state's advantage. If, quote, Ruritania, unquote, was being attacked by, quote, Moldavia, unquote, the first task of the state and its intellectuals was to convince the people of Ruritania that the attack was really upon them and not simply upon the ruling caste. In this way, a war between rulers was converted into a war between peoples, with each people coming to the defense of its rulers in the erroneous belief that the rulers were defending them. They weren't. They're not. They never have been. They never will be. Just saying. This device of, quote, nationalism, unquote, has only been successful in Western civilization in recent centuries. It was not too long ago that the mass of subjects regarded wars as irrelevant battles between various sets of nobles. Many and subtle are the ideological weapons that the state has wielded through the centuries. One excellent weapon has been tradition. The longer that the rule of a state has been able to preserve itself, the more powerful this weapon. For then, the X dynasty or the Y state has the seeming weight of centuries of tradition behind it. Bulletin point 16. Quote, the essential reason for obedience is that it has become a habit of the species. Power is for us a fact of nature. From the earliest days of recorded history, it has always presided over human destinies. The authorities which ruled brackets societies on brackets in former times did not disappear without bequeathing to their successors their privilege, nor without leaving in men's minds imprints which are cumulative in their effect. The succession of governments which, in the course of centuries, rule the same society may be looked on as one underlying government which takes on continuous accretions. Unquote. De Juvenel on Power Opposite, page 22. End of bulletin point. Worship of one's ancestors then becomes a non too subtle means of worship of one's ancient rulers. The greatest danger to the state is independent intellectual criticism. There is no better way to stifle that criticism than to attack any isolated voice, any raiser of new doubts, as a profane violator of the wisdom of his ancestors. Wow, that sounds oddly familiar, doesn't it? Another potent ideological force is to deprecate the individual and exalt the collectivity of society. For since any given rule implies majority acceptance, any ideological danger to that rule can only start from one or a few independently thinking individuals. The new idea, much less the new critical idea, must needs begin as a small minority opinion. Therefore, the state must nip the view in the bud by ridiculing any view that defies the opinions of the mass. Quote, listen only to your brothers, unquote, or, quote, adjust to society, unquote, thus become ideological weapons for crushing individual dissent. Bulletin point 17. Quote, on such uses of the religion of China, see Jacob's Passim. End of bulletin point. By such measures, the masses will never learn of the non-existence of their emperor's clothes. Bulletin point 18, brackets, government, on brackets, can see in an original idea is potential change, and hence an invasion of its prerogatives. The most dangerous man to any government is the man who is able to think things out for himself without regard to the prevailing superstitions and taboos. Almost inevitably, he comes to the conclusion that the government he lives under is dishonest, insane, and intolerable. And so, if he is romantic, he tries to change it. And even if he is not romantic personally, he is very apt to spread discontent among those who are. Unquote. H.L. Mencken, a Mencken, weird word, Chrestomathy, New York, Knopf, Knopf, weird word, 1949, page 145. It is also important for the state to make its rules seem inevitable. Even if its reign is disliked, it will then be met with passive resignation, as witness the familiar coupling of, quote, death and taxes, unquote. One method is to induce historiographical determinism as opposed to individual freedom of will. If the X dynasty rules us, this is because the inexorable laws of history, or the divine will, or the absolute, or the material productive forces have so decreed, and nothing any puny individuals may do can change this inevitable decree. It is also important for the state to inculcate in its subjects an aversion to any, quote, conspiracy theory of history, unquote, for a search for, quote, conspiracies, unquote, means a search for motives and an attribution of responsibility for historical misdeeds. If, however, any tyranny imposed by the state, or venality, or aggressive war was caused not by the state rulers, but by mysterious and arcane, quote, social forces, unquote, or by the imperfect state of the world, or if in some way everyone was responsible, quote, we are all murderers, unquote, proclaims one slogan, then there is no point to the people's becoming indignant or rising up against such misdeeds. Furthermore, an attack on, quote, conspiracy theories, unquote, means that the subjects will become more gullible in believing the, quote, general welfare, unquote, reasons that are always put forth by the state for engaging in any of its despotic actions. Wow, that kind of sounds like when politicians say, it's for the greater good, don't you know? Even to defend horrendous actions that no sane person would ever find tolerable if enacted upon them by anyone. Wow, that's amazing. A, quote, conspiracy theory, unquote, can unsettle the system by causing the public to doubt the state's ideological propaganda. Good. Just saying, good. Another tried and true method for bending subjects to one's will is inducing guilt. Any increase in private well-being can be attacked as, quote, unconscionable greed, materialism, or excessive affluence, unquote. Profit-making can be attacked as, quote, exploitation and usury, unquote. Mutually beneficial exchanges denounced as, quote, selfishness, unquote. And somehow, with the conclusion always being drawn that more resources should be siphoned from the private to the public sector. Wow, where we heard these terms before. The induced guilt makes the public more ready to do just that. For while individual persons tend to indulge in, quote, selfish greed, unquote, the failure of the state's rulers to engage in exchanges is supposed to signify their devotion to higher and nobler causes, parasitic predation being apparently morally and aesthetically lofty as compared to peaceful and productive work. In the present more secular age, the divine right of the state has been supplemented by the invocation of a new god, science. Hey, Fauci, looking at you. I'm going to get yeeted for that. State rule is now proclaimed as being ultra-scientific, as constituting planning by experts. But while, quote, reason, unquote, is invoked more than in previous centuries, this is not the true reason of the individual and his exercise of free will. It is still collectivist and determinist, still implying holistic aggregates and coercive manipulation of passive subjects by their rulers. The increasing use of scientific jargon has permitted the state's intellectuals to weave obscurantist apologia for a state rule that would have only met with derision by the populace of a simpler age. A robber who justified his theft by saying that he really helped his victims by his spending giving a boost to retail trade would find few converts. But when this theory is clothed in Keynesian equations and impressive references to the, quote, multiplier effect, it unfortunately carries more conviction. And so the assault on common sense proceeds. each age performing the task in its own ways. Sadly enough. Thus, excuse me. Thus, ideological support being vital to the state, it must unceasingly try to impress the public with its, quote, legitimacy, unquote, to distinguish its activities from those of mere brigands. The unremitting determination of its assault on common sense is no accident. For as Mencken vividly maintained, quote, the average man, whatever his errors otherwise, at least sees clearly that government is something lying outside him and outside the generality of his fellow men. That it is a separate, independent, and hostile power, only partly under his control, and capable of doing him great harm. Is it a fact of no significance that robbing the government is everywhere regarded as a crime of less magnitude than robbing an individual or even a corporation? What lies behind all this, I believe, is a deep sense of the fundamental antagonism between the government and the people it governs. It is apprehended not as a committee of citizens chosen to carry on the communal business of the whole population, but as a separate and autonomous corporation mainly devoted to exploiting the population for the benefit of its own members. When a private citizen is robbed, a worthy man is deprived of the fruits of his industry and thrift. When the government is robbed, the worst that happens is that certain rogues and loafers have less money to play with than they had before. The notion that they have earned that money is never entertained. To most sensible men, it would seem ludicrous. Unquote. Bulletin point 19, IBID, pages 146 through 47. Alrighty, and that concludes part 3 of Murray Rothbard's The Anatomy of the State. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to the next one. Until then, as always, live free or die trying.